I'm going to explain to you why podcast clipping for short form content sucks and what you need to do instead. Let's jump into it. All right, so in this episode, there are three main things that I want you to understand and learn about and take away from this. Number one is I want to teach you exactly why podcast clips suck in the first place. Number two, I want to teach you why certain ones happen to perform, so why there's some exceptions, and what it takes to even do that. And number three is what to do instead of these podcast clips that I have found to be extremely successful, way better and more time efficient, and overall a better strategy for content. Now, one thing I do want to preface about this is that I 100% believe that having a podcast is extremely important. I think that if you are directly trying to offer someone a specific service or a product, then one of the best ways that you can accelerate that trust in that process of, trust efficiency and having to guide them through that know, like, and trust sequence is to have long form content, right? So whether that be just through the long form content you create that's unique pieces, whether it be having a podcast. I think the podcast is one of the easiest ways to do it, just like I do it, because I want to establish trust and give value and show you know what I'm doing. So we're not talking about not doing a podcast, but there's this common message or theme that I see all across social media, especially from a program called Opus that runs a lot of ads because they're very successful in their marketing, that promotes this idea of being able to take a long form piece of content and turn it into 30, 50, sometimes even up to 100 different pieces of content that you can post for your social media. The problem with that is that most people who do this, including myself, have done this in the past and have found very little success with it. Like, there are reasons why podcast clips are not as good as you think. But for most people, what they care about is they know they need to be putting stuff on social media. They know they need to have a presence on there. And so the easiest way around that is to do the long form as the number one priority, maybe even just use that as the main strategy and go and build a following on maybe something like YouTube. And then just managing the presence by just taking those clips and putting them on Instagram and these other places so that there at least is some presence and some awareness. And that's totally fine. But if you're someone where you're trying to actively find the best strategy for content and for it to perform at the best levels, then this is going to be the episode for you, because I'm going to explain to you why most of the time it doesn't work, what it would take to make it work, and the best solution is what to do instead, because I think that is an even better option. All right, so to kind of jump into this, the first biggest principle you need to understand is that podcast clips lack the viral framework structure. So if I haven't already talked about this in another podcast episode, the viral framework is a very simple 3-element structure. So you have your hook, you have your value or your substance, and then last is going to be your payoff and your takeaway. And in all three of those cases, this structure and format is universal for most types of content, but it's really important when it comes to talking head and podcast type content. Now, that's typically what this is right now. This is what I'm doing. But even if you think you have those three structures like laid off and it makes sense, there's still a chance that it's not going to perform that high, and for multiple different reasons. So when we're talking about a podcast, one of the hardest things to understand is when you're doing a podcast, maybe you're doing it solo by yourself, which could be an exception to this rule to some degree. But most of the time you're doing this as like a round table discussion. Maybe it's with another person, maybe it's an interview. And when you do it in that format, one of the things that you cannot control is rabbit trails, right? Or maybe it's that someone is trying to elaborate a point or maybe share a story. And the challenge is that they're making great progress. It seems like they're getting to the point, but then all of a sudden it passes the 60-second mark. Now we're into the 90-second mark, which typically you can still post 90-second type content on most short form platforms. I think YouTube just recently launched 90 seconds for them, for their shorts. But even at that, that's just a much longer time for retention that you have to manage to keep people's attention for. And so unless that content is extremely valuable and insightful, it's going to make it harder for your content to perform. So in general, you want to aim for that 60-second. But if it's prolonging past that, now you're kind of stretching it. But what happens a lot of the time is that you have what feels like a really good hook, but then the idea of whatever's being talked about, it doesn't land the plane. It doesn't land the point by the end of those 60 seconds. Sometimes I've seen videos perform where it doesn't get to that, but it's very rare. And the platform that I see that do the best on is typically YouTube compared to every other platform, especially YouTube Shorts. So for one, rabbit trails are really hard to manage. If you're talking about something for too long and you can't seem to get it down to 60 seconds and you clip that thing up, just because you might have, a good hook, it lacks that payoff or that takeaway. Now, in the mindset of the believer, I'm sorry, not the believer, of the viewer, when they are watching this content and they get a hook, the best definition I've ever heard for a hook, which I have talked about in previous content I know, is that a hook is just setting an expectation in the viewer's mind of what they're going to get by watching the rest of that content. And so if you have a really good hook and it's going to say something about the content about, I had this story of this thing happen to me one time, and then they go on to tell that story, and maybe they're a good storyteller, but it doesn't land the plane, your only way to save that is potentially doing a part 1 and a part 2 and just hoping that the part 1 does well enough for the part 2 to perform as well. But sometimes if you don't post it fast enough, or you don't get around to making that second post and making that one follow up, it actually can backfire on your conversions, because people absolutely hate seeing part 1 and part 2 videos when they know they're being manipulated to go and follow the account and they can't even find that video. So you have to tread lightly on that and make sure you're disciplined in posting both of those. The next, and I think probably the bigger case, is that your hooks are probably not that great. Now, in podcast content, sometimes you get great hooks. Sometimes you have some content that actually does have a really good hook to it. But the challenge is that the hook, you can't variate on it. You can't change it. There's certain things you can try to do to manipulate it a little bit. But very rarely do you even have those good hooks. So when people say, hey, make 30 pieces of content out of one podcast episode, most of the time it's going to be like maybe you have 1 or 2 videos that could perform well. Now, if you're using a platform like Opus and you're using that to scrub all the clips and it gives you these virality scores, I do not believe every single one of them ever. Because every time I posted one of those clips that told me at a 99 out of 100 on the virality score, then what they get to do is they get to place the blame on the algorithm and not on the quality of the content. And so the viewer believes, no, this is great content. This tells me that this is viral. But then when I go and post it, it's not doing well. Well, it's got to be the algorithm. It's got to be something else. Maybe it's my posting times. Maybe I'm not using enough hashtags. Maybe it's, one of those things. And so then, Opus is off the hook, but then you think that it has to do with the platform, and it just has to do with the content sucking. And so hooks is one of the most important parts, because if you cannot get someone in the first 3 to 5 seconds to want to commit to watching the rest of your content, it doesn't matter what the rest says. So you have to be really good at hooks. And so for most podcasts that are a free-flowing conversation, you're not thinking about hooks on the top of your head. You're not thinking about making a bold statement or asking a question in a very short-winded type of way. You're not thinking about structuring your piece that you're about to say for the next 60 seconds in a way where it does that, unless you have been trained to do it that way. And that's very hard to do, because if you're not trained to think that way and you haven't been doing this with a lot of reps, then that just takes time. So time is going to be your variable that you're missing in this equation, and you just have to do more reps with that intentionality and that training, and then you can get to a place where maybe it does perform better. And then the last thing that I would say just around podcasting clips and this stuff in general is, it depends on the topic and depends on what you're talking about. But if you're all in like one topic, you're not into like multiple topics, and you're just going down the rabbit hole of one thing, sometimes you have missing context. And what I mean by that is that if you're having a really great conversation about someone's story or their testimony or some like experience that they had, or maybe it's just like their wisdom and insight, usually the conversation is if the interviewer is doing a good job at this, and I'm talking about in the context of an interviewer, okay, is usually you're adding onto the questions and you're building up to something. Sometimes you're building up to something directly. Sometimes you're just building up on the conversation. But in general, each question is usually an add-on to the question prior. And so, asking the question, how did you get through that? Well, you would need to have the context of knowing what was just being talked about in order to understand what did they go through? What was the situation there? So even if you have what could be technically a good quote or a good question or a good hook, if you're missing the context, it's going to be really hard for people to understand the value of what you're saying. And so a lot of them are just going to drop off. They're not going to listen. They're not going to follow all the way through. You might have that context because you're like, oh, this is such a great conversation. We were talking about this and this thing. But you have to remember that most of this content, actually all of this content, if it's coming from your podcast, most of it is going to non-followers and people who have not seen the whole episode, right? And so if they don't have that context, then it doesn't matter how good you think the content is. They don't have the full understanding to watch that piece and to see the value from that. And so if you're missing context in that content, it's not going to perform either. All right, so those are some of the main reasons why podcast clips don't always perform, or most of the time they do not perform well. But let's talk about a couple of exceptions, because clearly they work, right? Like you see the podcast clips out there, you see that they're performing. And so you wonder, okay, well, if it's working for them, then it can work for me. Let's talk about why that content typically tends to perform well for them and what we can do through this and maybe how you can apply this to your content. All right. So number one, usually the content that you see this work the best in is usually through interview content. Now, there are exceptions to this as well, where it can apply to someone who's doing, two people in the same room that are the same co-hosts that have the same kind of conversations or whatever. And that might work well. One of the best examples that I could see of that is Travis and Jason Kelsey, who run the New Heights podcast. It's pretty much them unless they have a guest, but they're able to carry the conversation and the topics by themselves through it. And so it makes it easier for their content to perform better because of them being consistent in what they're doing, and for a couple other reasons that I am going to talk about in just a minute. But most of the time, you're going to see the best performing type of content usually coming from interview type content. Now, the best example of this that I can see where this has performed super, super well in the past is going to be Chris Williamson. And Chris Williamson is a podcaster. He is a YouTuber. He's been doing content for, I want to say, the last 5 years. I want to say he came from The Bachelor, or maybe it was The Bachelorette. I think it was one of the two. And he got a lot of popularity through that. He's a very handsome man, very aesthetic voice. I don't know if that's the way you would phrase that. Aesthetic voice. Pleasing voice? I don't know. He's got a British accent. And I swear, anybody who has an accent that's not American, they're just more fun to listen to. But he runs a podcast where he interviews people, and he's done a really great job of bringing on really unique guests onto his platform. But what Chris does so well with his content is that he is very short-winded on his side of the conversation. So what he's typically doing is he's just setting up the interviewee to answer questions and to frame them into creating a piece of content for him, because he's just saying either a quick statement, a quick quote, or bringing up a quick question, and he's making it to where it goes back to the interviewer or interviewee the entire time. And so the brevity is honestly a big factor into it, because if you have a question that takes, 30 seconds to elaborate on and then ask the question, now that hook that could have been that question doesn't work because you're spending 30 seconds of someone in short form trying to listen to that thing, get enough attention to want to keep listening and then hear the answer. It's just not always going to work. And that's why in long form it works great, because you're obviously in the conversation and people are sitting down and they're ready to listen to a long form piece of content. But in the short form world where you are scrolling super fast through stuff, it's got to be quick. And so that's why Chris does a great job at this, and his content seems to perform super well, because he has a lot of brevity in what he does. A big thing that I've also seen from this too, and you might notice this actually a lot now, is podcast clips work really well, but almost always on secondary accounts. So what I mean is that if you're posting the content on your main account, it might perform well. It might, do okay, but a lot of repost accounts, or accounts that kind of are a conglomerate of, or a compilation of so many different clips from different podcasts. Usually it's around business, or it's about health or mindset, or some people even just do it for, let's say, like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan has the #1 podcast in the world. If you take someone like him, then what they do is they just go and clip up tons of clips from his podcast, and they just post and distribute those nonstop. But what they do, and this is what's different, is that they edit it in a way where it almost is subconsciously done through the eyes of a reposter. And so the way that people perceive it is oh, this clearly looks like a clip that wouldn't be on the original page, but it's one that someone remixed, where they changed the captions, they added some music to it, they even maybe made it black and white. They did something to it that made it feel more like someone was reposting this because they felt that this is a great piece of content, instead of the original creator putting it out there saying, I think this is a great piece of content. It's a really strange thing, and I feel like we can dive a lot deeper into it, but just think about on a psychological level that if you see a piece of content that is in black and white, it has different fonts to it that are not the ones that you typically see on the main creator's account. They have this viral type music that's behind it that you kind of see trending all over the place. And you kind of have this feeling where it's someone went out of their way to clip this because they thought that this was such a great piece of content, and they made it in a way where it didn't feel like it had to follow the brand pillars or the guidelines that a traditional account does, that they want to stick to their aesthetic or whatever. And you see that, and you're you're open to the idea of listening to that because you're like, this must be a really great piece of content. And when it's on these repost accounts, usually it is top quality content. It's the content that they believe is the best out there. And so they want to reshare those best clips. So you see a lot of podcast clips, but it's all like brought together and bundled into these accounts that are just grabbing the best clips that are out there. And it's like the 1% of the 1%. And so when you see this content performing well, I mean, one of your tactics that you can apply if you want to do this is you need to actually stop posting your content in a very basic format and start doing things where it doesn't feel like you posting on your account, but it feels like you reposting it as if it was from someone else's account. And some of the off the cuff type of ways that I would do that is do it in like a black and white. So the color is like color graded differently. So it doesn't feel like it's what should be on your feed because it's not usually that way. Add more like emotional music that is trending that kind of feels like it's tying way deeper into like, this is like a really like good piece of content because you hear the music. And we talked about this in our Hooks Masterclass series of the audible hook and how when you hear certain types of music, you automatically trigger a schema of, oh, this usually has to do with like really emotional content or it's leading up to some drop or something. You're like, I got to keep listening to this. And so the audio is a really big factor too. Do it in a meme card format. So literally like take off the top part of your video and just make it white and then just put like a headline that goes above it and make it reactionary. So make it like, this is so true, or like this changed my life, or I never thought about it like this before. Just think about like reactionary type content for what that would be. The best places to go get inspiration for that are accounts like Memes Are. I think Lad Bible is a pretty great one as well. And then go to like ESPN or Sports Center, these accounts where they're just reposting sports content. A lot of the time they have like really good headlines that they use where it's all just reactionary stuff. And that seems to perform the best. So try like the reactionary with the meme card, try changing up the colors of it, use different fonts than what you traditionally do. Try a bunch of those different things and see if that helps with performing. Now, sometimes it can, sometimes it doesn't, but you're definitely going to have a better chance of doing it that way than just trying to make it polished the same way that you want it. Because when you polish it and you feel like it's really good looking and you put that on your account, a lot of the times people see that like you're posting that on your account, so you believe that this is valuable. But when you see repost content on other accounts, that tells you automatically that this was valuable to someone else. So clearly they wanted to take the effort and time to make this a repost on their account so that other people got that value as well. So I think that's super, super key. The last points that I want to make on how you can get these exceptions, and this is like the kind of like the easy, but also the more challenging part, is it has to do with a few different things. One is if you're doing it in an interview style, usually the person that they're interviewing is extremely popular or very, very familiar. If I were to get Mr. Beast on my podcast and I created a thumbnail that said like, me and Mr. Beast like talk about like Mr. Beast reveals his top secrets for social media, or Mr. Beast predicts YouTube for 2025, everybody's going to go watch that. And then the clips that are going to come from that, when you clip their face and you put their face first, obviously it's going to perform because people know who that person is. And they're like, I'm going to listen in because whatever they say, like I'm super interested in whatever they have. Because they always have really good insight. They're like the best in the industry. It's like the same with Elon Musk, or think like a Mark Zuckerberg, or even think like political commentators like Ben Shapiro. You see Ben Shapiro on all these different podcasts and these places that are not maybe conservative, but is still like he's willing to go out there in the lion's den and have these conversations. Like Jubilee. Jubilee's a great account that does this. You're going to see a much higher conversion rate on the socials because people know who that is. And they're like, I got to listen to what this guy's to say because he almost always has something to say that's either a really hot take or is super smart and intellectual. And we appreciate those kinds of people, but that's built trust over time. Okay. The next is going to be that they have extremely controversial or bold takes. So before Andrew Tate became Andrew Tate was just making up really bold claims. Now this guy says ridiculous things and a lot of things that I don't necessarily condone. But at the same time, like it worked. Right? Like he said things that resonated with guys where they're like, this makes a lot of sense. Like I kind of agree with this, or I'd repost this because he's kind of saying what, like, I don't know, I feel like no one's been saying recently. And so usually when you have those bold takes, you're saying what other people are thinking, but they don't want to speak. And so you being able to step out in that boldness actually can make a big difference. But you have to have someone on your podcast that has that, right? You have to be, if you are that person, you have to have really controversial takes. You have to be willing to say things that to some degree is going to force tribes of people that are for you and people that are against you. Like, you have to get them to feel something. If they don't feel anything and they're indifferent about you, they're going to forget you. So you have to be able to do something that strikes enough emotion in them for either them to be like, I'm getting on the ship, I'm going with you, or they're like, I would rather burn your ship to the ground because I don't want to see you take off because I'm afraid of what you're going to do to this world. And so you kind of get those camps, and we're living in a world of polarity right now. But if you can do that the right way, you can get a lot more traction with that content because you're dealing with someone that's going to say something that's super bold and out of freaking thin air, honestly. The next is high levels of insight or knowledge. So I think this can also pair in with another idea that has to do with like entertainment. So like if you do entertainment content, it typically tends to perform better than if you're doing educational based content, because most people are getting on social media to be entertained. They're getting online because they want to take a break. They want to numb their brain out. They want to get away from the work. They're going to the bathroom. They're bored, or maybe they don't want to interact with people at like a social event. And so they're going to social media instead. And so what happens is that they're getting on this platform and they're not always thinking about, I want to learn. And so it's harder for that kind of content to perform well if you're doing educational based stuff versus entertainment, where it's like, this is all for fun. One account that's done an incredible job of doing this and blowing up through an agency that I'm very close with is called it's gonna Dropout podcast. I was so close to forgetting that and having to edit this. The Dropouts podcast. It is a podcast that's taken off in the last couple of years. I think that they have over, I want to say 1 million followers now. It's pretty massive. But they're an entertainment podcast and they do a lot of controversial takes and they have like real conversations that are kind of, a little spicy. The Whatever podcast is another one that's pretty big too. But that's, again, you're going back to like, they have a very unique position in the market. They're doing something that's different. And they're willing to bring on the guests that are going to say crazy things or be the person that says the crazy things, because everyone is so normalized to kind of these levels of, general content and value-based content that when they're looking for that stimulus, they're looking for those accounts that are way more exceptional in what they say and what they do and just doing things in a different way that is not the same thing over and over again. Like even me doing content like this to you with this podcast and in my garage and studio space, man, this is pretty generic. This is what a lot of people do, even with having lion paintings in the back and, having nice audio and it looking cool. That's great, but it's not going to stand out as if I was doing this on a bridge or on the dam of, Hoover Dam or something like that, where I'm in a ridiculous place and people are like, what is happening? Right. So point is you got to do something like that. But going back to the levels of insight and knowledge, I think the best example of this would probably be the Kelsey bros. So Jason Kelsey, Travis Kelsey, both professional football players. Jason Kelsey recently retired. Travis is still playing for the Chiefs. I hate them. And they have a podcast that's called New Heights. And it's just them two. And while they're already popular figures and they were, doing pretty well when they first started off because they already have some traction because Travis Kelsey was, one of the best tight ends in the league. And Jason is just one of the most likable human beings in the world. They were already doing pretty well with their podcast and it was entertainment based, but also they talked a lot about like inside NFL, like inside baseball type stuff, right? Where you're kind of getting insights into what is the program like, what is the practices like, what are the coaches like, what are the experiences post and after games? Because they would do NFL breakdowns, so they would break down the games and talk about it. And so you get like on the field, basically like almost like journalism testimonials where you're kind of listening in on the people that are breaking down what happened because they were boots on the ground for it. And that's really cool. And so you're getting unique insight where like you can't go elsewhere for that. You cannot, unless there's another football player that's doing it, you cannot go to anybody else who has that unique experience to get that kind of insight and information. And so you have to be someone who is so separate in the market and has such unique insights that you can provide information in a way where when you post that kind of stuff online, it piques people's interest because it's different, it's unique, it's out of there, it's not the same that what everybody else is doing. But if you can't do that, then obviously you're gonna have a much harder time with that kind of content. But that's how these other guys have been able to perform well, is because they're either extremely popular, they're extremely controversial, or they have high levels of insight and knowledge, and they're probably in the entertainment space more than the education space. Doing the education route is just going to be the hardest out of all of these, but you can still make it happen. It just has to be done in the right way. All right, so that's everything around like why that content works. Hope you're getting some value out of this. If it is, let me know. Hit the subscribe button or make sure you're following on socials, because I'm just trying to create tons of content for you guys that hopefully is valuable to you in your journey of content. But let's keep going. The last thing that I would say is what you should be doing instead. So we've talked about why podcast clips don't usually work. We've talked about where the exceptions typically lie and what I have seen working out there. And then last, let's talk about what you should be doing instead of podcast content. Now, again, I'm not advocating to stop your podcast. I think it's one of the best things you could do as far as building trust with potential clients you're trying to offer services to, or just building your own brand and being able to connect and build a community. So still do the podcast. But when you're thinking about your social media strategy, podcasting should be supplemental, but it should not be foundational to what your content strategy is. What you should be doing instead are what are called smart sessions. And smart sessions is something that I've talked about in other podcast clips before and on social media. It's my main strategy that I use with my clients. And it's like the perfect combination of basically podcasting and like scripted content that you're reading off of a teleprompter for recording content. Another name for this that you might have heard of before is called mockcasts. And mockcasts is what it sounds like. It's like a podcast, but it's not actually real in the sense that you're not posting that long form piece of content. And what you're doing in these sessions instead is that they are hyper-controlled sessions where you are coming up and spitting out ideas and doing content pieces in 60 to 90 second intervals over and over and over again. You prep your ideas before, you have a bunch of different topics, you have different things you want to talk about, you figure out crafting the best possible hook ever, and then you usually either sit down with another person, or if you are crazy enough, you use something like ChatGPT and the voice thing. I don't even think that works yet. I've theorized doing that, but I don't even think that I've landed that yet. Your other option is talking to a wall. And I wouldn't do that. You could actually technically do it this way too, where I have a teleprompter that's set up right here. I'm looking through it towards my camera and it has my notes on this as well. But I could be FaceTiming someone else right now. And so I could be FaceTiming my partner, Reese, who I do content with for our clients. He could be on the other side with his face, and I could do these sessions where I'm looking directly at the camera, and I could do it that way, or do it where I'm facing off to the side like this as if we're having a conversation, and it feels like it's a podcast clip, but in actuality, they're just random short clips that you have created, with a bunch of them at a time. Now, a couple of caveats with this. One, this is becoming more popular. A lot of people are doing this. And two, because of that, people are starting to read through it. They're reading through the BS. They know when a clip feels fake and when it doesn't feel like a podcast and they're just talking off camera. So a lot of people kind of get annoyed from this. So if you're going to do this, you cannot be monotone. You cannot be reading a script or just sounding boring when you do this, because people are going to read it and they're going to be like, dude, I'm not going to watch your content because it just feels disingenuous. Like if it doesn't feel genuine, they're gone. So maybe it makes sense to do it this way, where you do a Zoom video and set up like this and talk to a person this way towards the camera. But if you feel like you can be having a natural conversation where you can, say the things you want to say and it feels like it flows naturally and people feel like it's a natural podcast, then it is a great way to do that. In either camp, with our clients and what we do, we train them in a way where they feel natural, they feel like it's a podcast clip or piece, or people just know that it is like an educational piece of content off the side and they're not bothered by it that much. It just depends on your audience. But when you go viral, you're going to see a lot of hate that usually comes in that if it feels disingenuous. But the way that these smart sessions work is you set up a podcast studio space just like this, set up your video, set up your audio, set up all those things, do it in whatever is a great space that you like the visuals of, that maybe matches with your what your audience would resonate with. And then usually you want to have someone else that's with you and you want to come and prep a bunch of ideas, prep like 20 to 30 different ideas. Have someone who's probably good at like interviews or asking questions or carrying on the dialogue to be there with you. Bonus points if they have any experience with crafting hooks, with copywriting, with social content, and basically like being able to actually gauge and judge this on a much more professional level than just having a friend that does this. But you can do this with just a friend or somebody else that would be interested in helping you with this content. You sit down, you hit the record button, make sure your audio sounds good. And then from there, you riff. You have your first idea. And let's say my first idea, if we're going to do like social content, is why podcast clips suck based on this piece. I would turn to my person that I'm doing this interview with. So I'm looking off camera and I have a hook prepped for it. So let's just say out of nowhere, I say that my hook is like podcast clips suck for short form content. So I would be looking off the side. And the way I would do it is I want it to feel like a natural sentence where it's like in the middle of a conversation. So I would say something like, yeah, I believe that podcast clips are probably one of the most, I just blanked on it. Yeah, I probably believe, and I'm doing this off the cuff for you, so don't judge me, okay? So if I'm looking over and I'm having a conversation and I say, yeah, I think podcast clips are one of the worst strategies for short form content. So maybe it kind of feels like it's in a conversation, or maybe you have them ask the question and then you just answer the question, but you put a camera on them too and they ask it. So it does feel like a podcast. Multiple ways you can do this. But here's the big caveat about why this works better is because that person, their main job, other than just kind of keeping the conversation going, is just to set a timer on their phone for 60 seconds when you start to 90 seconds and just gauge and be like, all right, I think you did it. I think that you got your hook in there. You had the value. It was in the middle of the Viral framework. And then you have your payoff and your takeaway at the end. It feels like you have a good takeaway. It feels like it kind of flowed all together. That was a really good take. And you just do that over and over and over again. And in a matter of 3 hours of doing this, you can prep anywhere from 30 to 90 pieces of content for your socials. It just depends on how fast you are, how many different variations, of hooks that you have. A couple of different variables like that. But in general, the reason why this works better is because you can control the viral framework, you can control your hook and even test different types of hooks. You can do redos if you didn't like your take. So even in a podcast where you can't redo your take and be like, I wish I would have said this instead, you can do it right then and there. And then you can do this in like a hyper-controlled session where you crank it all out once and you have a content for over a month and you have plenty of pieces that you can be posting. This is exactly what I do with my clients. It's exactly what I do with my content. And it saves me so much time from having to script every single piece and have to look at the camera and read off of a teleprompter in a script by being able to just do this with my partner and record content in those sessions. And the main thing that you need to know about these smart sessions is that it comes with the context of you need to have the reps and come with the ideas where you're doing the actual research about what you want to talk about, what do you think is trending, what is relevant for your audience and solving pain points, and doing your best you can to make it tangible. And there's so many different principles within that about storytelling, using concrete examples, simplification of your word choice and vocabulary, pacing, conviction and emotion, like any of those things that add to the layers of being able to perform at a higher level. If you aren't putting in the time and the effort to do that and you just sound monotone while doing these things and it doesn't feel natural, it's still not going to perform that well. And one of the most important elements of all this is that your hooks still need to be so dang good that when you do post this content, the hooks are going to be the thing that hook people and make them want to watch the rest of it. If you're like, that was a great take and your hook sucked because you spent 3 minutes on it and you didn't do any more research or like come up with variations of it to try it again and get more creative, then your content might not even perform any better than a podcast clip can. Like you have to be very intentional with this strategy in order for it to perform. But when you do it right, you cancel out all of the issues that comes with a podcast while still being able to borrow some of the elements of podcast content that seems to perform the best and being able to do it at volume to where you only have to do it once and then everything else is just being edited on the back end to then be distributed. But you don't have to do, multiple episodes a week or being able to do like even weekly content. You can still do those things in your long form, but you don't have to be stressed with like, all right, we only got a couple of clips from this last podcast, so we need to create more long form in order to make good stuff. Supplement it with this. It's a one-time strategy, once a month. It's super easy. You can do more if you want, but it's going to perform a lot better. There is one other way that you can do this that I have seen work before, but is very uncommon to see, is Alex Hormozy did this. And I noticed this in one of his podcasts a while ago. I don't think he still does it based on the ones I've listened to recently. But what he'll do is he'll sit in front of the camera just like this. And he'll be looking at the camera and he'll have notes right here. And literally what he'll do is he'll start off by saying like 20 different business tips that I wish I would have known when I first started doing business. And the tips that he give are incredible tips, right? Like they're not just basic tips about just like, oh, maybe make sure you follow your LLC in the right country or whatever, or city or whatever it is. Like it's not stuff like that. Like it's really, really good tips. But when he structures it and he layers it by saying like 20 different tips, he's pretty transparent about being like, look, I'm going to use this for short form. And so what he does is he literally says TikTok 1, and then he has his hook, he says his hook, and then he riffs for like 60 seconds. And then he goes, TikTok 2, bam, says the hook, goes and breaks it down. TikTok 3, and he literally says it out loud. And so if you wanted to somehow combine both, where you didn't want to have to do your podcast separately and having to do short form separately, you can combine the two by still delivering value. Because to be honest, like the frameworks and the way you structure a podcast, it doesn't matter to people as long as you're delivering value. And so if you say, I'm going to give you 20 tips, and by the way, this is going to be for short form content, so I'm going to read off the headline of my hook, and then I'm just going to give it, but I'm still giving you the value. And you're not going to care because it's still giving you the value. they're not going to care. They just aren't, right? Like if Alex Hormozi was like, hey, I'm going to do a masterclass, but we're going to do it in my basement. I'm still showing up in his basement. Doesn't have to be at the Ritz-Carlton in one of their, like freaking conference rooms. I'm showing up in that basement because it's the value that matters, not the way that it's executed and like the extra settings and the things that you just don't really care a lot about. So don't get lost in the weeds of that. But if you're someone who wants to try that, I might even try it myself, where I'm just like, hey, 20 different business tips for content, and I'm just going to riff on them to the camera. Then you might see that content go out, but then you as the viewer, you don't care because it's still valuable. So that's the only one that I've seen that's where you can combine both of them and it still works super well together. And it doesn't feel like people are being robbed or manipulated, or it doesn't feel like it's disingenuous. It still is delivering all the value and you're being able to kill two birds with one stone. So that way works. You can do that. I suggest both. If you can try it out, just test. That's what matters, being able to get out there and test what works and what works best for your schedule and for your availability. But in general, the point that I want to leave you with is that podcast clips are very unpredictable, they're unreliable, and they only work sometimes. And there's a lot of reasons that they can work, but there are exceptions that require a lot of work or a lot of networking. And that can be a lot of your time too. And the best alternative to be able to make this work for your content is to borrow this process of the smart sessions or a mockcast to do the same type of thing, to be able to record a ton of content, to be able to produce a bunch of different ideas, to test different hooks, to test ideas just in general with your audience, see what performs. And then honestly, if we're talking like next level stuff, like take the data that you're getting from that short form content and which is performing best and turn that into a podcast episode. Because then now you already have high intent from the viewers who watched that piece of content that said this was valuable and this is proven because it literally has data to back it. Now I'm going to make a podcast entire episode out of this because we can go even deeper into these things. So maybe even use this strategy of doing the smart sessions to test the ideas that you want to do for your podcast and be able to kill two birds with one stone and collect data instead of just going off of what you read online or just kind of assuming, which can still work, but it's a lot easier when you have content that performs better on socials where you can test that as well. All right, so that's all I got for you in this episode. I hope that was super valuable. If it was, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. Seek questions if you have them on my socials. You can go to Kings Media Co. to find me there. My personal is Remy Davenport. That's where you're going to find me doing exactly what I'm preaching right now, doing content, testing what's working, and doing it where it's not limited to being about Kings Media, but I can just do whatever so that you guys have multiple case studies and proof, not just from my clients, but also from me myself doing and preaching what I say so you guys can see it firsthand. Great. That's all I got for you guys in this episode. Keep crushing it with content, and I will see you guys in the next one.